Well, good day and welcome to SOP Save Our Planet. My name is Gary Willing. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. Now, I always do a couple things before I start, and the most important thing that I think that you can do when hearing this information is to take some time out of your day at some point and look into this information to see if it's true for you or not. If you check out the information on some of these websites, such as the Share International site, you'll get the best background information there than you can anywhere else. And that will really help to see for yourself if this is true for you or not. So that's why I always encourage everyone to check it out. And guess what? It's free. So it doesn't cost you anything to do this. The second thing that won't cost you a bit of money is to join the discussion. And I love it when you do this because it helps me to build the video for the next time. But if you post a comment, let me know what you think. A lot of times I'll chime in and comment on the comment. But I always try to answer questions that come my way. And if you post your question in the comment section, that's probably the best way to get the question to me. Then I'll try to answer it in the next video, or you can email me, searchforsigns@mail.com. Okie dokie. The Great White Brotherhood is said to be a spiritual hierarchy of enlightened beings working for the evolution of Earth. In your view, is this brotherhood a literal group, a symbolic archetype, or something else? It is a literal group of perfected, from our point of view, perfected men. Now, I say men only because they are all right now in male bodies, but eventually they'll start to incarnate more and more in female bodies as well. It doesn't mean that women are lesser than men. It just, the reason why they have that body type is an energetic reason. It helps them to anchor the spiritual energy better than the female body would do. But once it gets to the point where it's anchored enough, more and more of them will become, more and more of the masters will be in female bodies. Starting with the master who was the Madonna would be the first one to do this. But yes, it is a literal group, and they were known for who they were hundreds of thousands of years ago, directing humanity, teaching humanity, in our lives. We all knew who they were. Most of us looked up to them for their advice and so forth, but humanity wasn't really that evolved back then. And then what happened? And that's the $64,000 question before taxes, is what happened? Why do we not know about these beings? Well, what happened was somewhere around 100,000 or so years ago, there was a great battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And what sparked the battle was humanity was almost equally influenced by either side. So half of humanity was influenced more by the forces of darkness, and the other one were the lords of materiality, and the other half were influenced and were directed more directly, for lack of a better word or sentence, but they were directed more from the other side, from the forces of light, which is who I'm referring to. Now, that resulted in the destruction of Atlantis, which is a literal continent that was around up to about 100,000 years ago. It will eventually resurface, and we'll know for sure that it's real, but right now it's just in mythical folklore, really, is what it is. And so we don't really remember the life on Atlantis. There's kind of, people surmise where it could have been. Is it more toward Europe, or is it more toward, is it in the Pacific Ocean? I mean, all sorts of stuff. I've heard all sorts of theories on where Atlantis was and how big was it. It was a pretty large continent. I would say a little bit smaller than maybe Australia, if I had to guess. And it was right smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was quite an advanced continent in terms of the technology that was available at the time. But that technology was given to humanity by the masters. We didn't actually invent it ourselves. Anyway, so that war that raged on for I don't know how many years eventually ended in the destruction of Atlantis. And it was written into the Bible, into the Old Testament, as the flood. Noah was a master who was warning the people of the time of this impending disaster. And I guess those people who got off the continent lived for a little while longer, and the other ones that didn't, well, that, it's pretty obvious what happened to them. But what happened after that was a stalemate between these masters from these different groups, the forces of darkness and the forces of light. There was a stalemate. So they both decided, as I guess an agreement between the with this stalemate, was that they would not teach or guide humanity directly, either side. So the forces of darkness retreated to their retreats, and the forces of light retreated to theirs. And so for eons, really, for thousands upon thousands of years, these masters have been living away from humanity, so far from the average person that it would almost be impossible for someone to stumble across one of their homes and just happen to kind of stumble across and, oh, well, there's somebody. They would have had to have been guided to where they were. So most of these masters moved into the very, very high mountains of the Himalayas, some into the Andes, some into the Rockies, some into the Urals, some more into different deserts and so forth. So for 100,000 years or so, these masters guided and inspired humanity indirectly. Now, the work and activity of these masters went on for that entire time, but only through the men and women in the world, the disciples in the world, that were doing some portion of one of these masters' plans, that were kind of moving humanity along. But they knew all along, ever since they retreated, they knew all along that they would have to eventually come back into the everyday world and teach humanity the way that they did a little over 100,000 years ago. And Ben used to always say this, and it really didn't dawn on me until I kept hearing it for years. But the reason why they have to come back into the everyday world is not only to help us, but also because of their evolution. This is a part of their evolutionary plan as these masters of wisdom, to come back into the everyday world. So they knew like I said, for about 100,000 years that they would have to come back at some point. It was hoped, and this is something to keep in mind when it comes to the length of time that it's been taking for us to recognize Maitreya on TV, but it was hoped that it would be another 1,000 years from now, actually, that humanity would be ready to receive these masters and start to learn from them in the way that they will eventually be teaching us again. 1,000 years, that's a long time. But what happened? Well, up until really not that long ago, really, relatively speaking, only a little over 100 years ago. Well, actually, less than that. Actually, within the last 100 years, they made the decision to come back, far sooner than they had originally expected. Now, it started kind of, actually, believe it or not, the retracement of their steps started with, I would say, what's been written in the New Testament to kind of prepare men's minds for the return of the awaited teachers. But every one of these religious groups over the last few thousand years have been waiting for a teacher to come back. They couldn't really agree on who it is. They all have their own different view. They all have their own different name. The teacher is going to come back in its own way, but they were really talking about the same teacher, which is who I've been talking about in these videos for the last few years, Maitreya. They don't expect him to come back as that name, except for one group, which is the Buddhists, are expecting Maitreya Buddha to come back. But they're waiting for him to come back in about 500,000 years. That's a long time. But so they got the name right, but the timing wrong. But here's the thing: when we see Maitreya, and people have already seen him and already asked him, "Are you the Imam Mahdi, or are you the Christ, or whatever?" He doesn't say yes, and I don't think he ever will. But what he says is, "These are just names that I'm looked for. It doesn't mean that I am that, you know what I'm saying?" Because he isn't the Imam Mahdi per se, but these are just names that we came up with to describe this wonderful teacher, this world teacher. But he would say he just wants to be referred to as a teacher. But these names, he says, cause confusion, so not to really rely on them too much, I guess. But anywho, so I do think that the emergence of the Maitreya and these masters of wisdom started with the religions expecting this teacher to come back at some point. Like I said, again, expecting him at different times, coming in a different way, with different meanings for why they're coming back and so forth. But also, too, something that I think is just being an artist myself, a budding artist myself, this to me is quite extraordinary. But about 300 or so years ago, the masters were still expecting to come back in about 1,000 years. That was, like I said, that was the plan all along. And Maitreya was able to overshadow, which is a form of telepathy. He was able to overshadow one of the painters, one of the most famous painters of all time, Rembrandt, who painted portraits and self-portraits very realistically. So this is before photography. This was before, we had the ability to do those kind of things. But the way that he painted, being a part of the Flemish school of painting, was quite extraordinary and very realistic. And so he painted, but he also painted, I think, upwards of 80 or so self-portraits. And he wasn't necessarily a stunningly good-looking person. In fact, he was very plain. His face isn't very symmetrical. It's very realistic, like most people. He's not this chiseled Adonis that most people paint, right? But he was painting these self-portraits for some reason, and it wasn't because he was narcissistic. He was painting it because he was being overshadowed by Maitreya at the time, and so Maitreya was able to paint, even though it's Rembrandt's face. He was able to paint his own eyes into the painting. And remember, the eyes are the window to the soul. So when you see a Rembrandt painting for real and you look into the eyes, there is something very magnetic about the eyes and the quality of the way that he painted his own eyes into the painting. But that was actually Maitreya doing it telepathically as a little form of way of reintroducing us back in, to the understanding of who and what these masters are. Now, moving on. So then what happened was, again, they were thinking it was about 1,000 years from now before they would come back. World War I and World War II happened. And this was a resurfacing of that ancient war that destroyed Atlantis over 100,000 years ago. And with the destruction of the Axis powers, and also with the invention of the nuclear bomb, Maitreya said himself that he himself would have to come back along with his masters, far sooner than anyone had expected. And he made this announcement in June of 1945. So, 80 years ago? I guess? Yeah, so, 80 years, a little over 80 years ago, he made this announcement that they would have to come back. But humanity would have to do 3 things in order to signal to him that we were ready for them to come back into the everyday world. The first was a measure of peace had to have been established. And if you look at it, even though there are battles all over the place and there are wars and this, that, and the other, and even though we have the capacity to destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons, there is a element of peace that has been established in the world since World War II. The borders of nations, by and large, have been very stable. And there hasn't been this, sweeping through of a nation from one nation invading another. Now, there's been invasions in other ways, economically and different things like that, or a bombing here or a bombing there, or a war between these nations. But for the most part, by and large, it's not perfect, but for the most part, there has been this standardization in the map to where nations have been, the borders have been very stable. The other thing that I think that did bring about a measure of peace was the Marshall Plan, because that's the second step, the principle of sharing, which will eventually be a universal process all throughout humanity that will bring about true and lasting peace. But the principle of sharing was tried very briefly with the Marshall Plan. And according to Maitreya, one of the indicators would have to be that just the idea of the principle of sharing had to start to be talked about or looked at or pondered on by our world leaders at that time, which apparently there was enough of it to where that signaled to him that we were ready for him to come back. So a measure of peace, the principle of sharing had to start to be governing the minds of the men at the time. And then the third thing was And that, like I said, I always tongue-in-cheek say this because I'm really into politics, but I really don't see this. But he must have seen enough of it to where it signaled to him that we were ready, is the political parties around the world had to start to clean up some of their corruption. So those three things happened enough. And then in the 50s, he asked 5 disciples to help ready humanity for the return of not only Maitreya, but these masters. One in New York, Benjamin Creme in London, one in Geneva, one in Darjeeling, and one in Tokyo. The unfortunate thing is that Benjamin Creme was the only one of these disciples to take up the work. The others either didn't believe it, didn't respond, whether they believed it or not, or like in the case of the woman in Tokyo, started to believe that she herself was Maitreya. So that created some complications that way. But that was, something that most of us aren't unaware of when it comes to this information. We just think that Benjamin Creme was the only person that was taking up this information, or well, he was the only one to take it up, but he wasn't the only one to be asked, is really what it is. So he was then trained by his own master for his role as kind of the John the Baptist of this time, to let the world know that Maitreya and these masters were coming back into the world. And around the mid-70s, I can't remember the exact year, but it was about a year or two before Maitreya actually entered London. But 5 masters left their ancient abodes and entered 5 major cities. And Ben always said it was never in an order of importance, but this was the order in which it happened. The first master went into Tokyo and set up residence on the outskirts. No, sorry, I just misspoke. The first one entered New York, on the outskirts of New York. The second one went into London, who is a different master from Maitreya. The third one went into Geneva. Then one went into Darjeeling, which is a very tiny, it's the smallest of these major centers. Most of these centers are huge metropolitan cities, but Darjeeling is not. Darjeeling is a very tiny town, actually, in northern India. And then the last one went into Tokyo. And then 2 more not long after that went into 2 other minor centers. The first one went into Rome, who is the master, who is Jesus. That's the most popular of all these masters, actually, at this moment in time. And then the other one went into Moscow. And then sometime after that, Maitreya secretly and very quietly went into London on July 19th, 1977, which I think I looked it up. It was a Tuesday, so wasn't on the weekend, wasn't on a Monday, wasn't a Friday. it was Tuesday. So I know Tuesday isn't that big of a deal for most people, but it was historically, even though we don't really look at July 19th like this. It was probably one of the most historic days of all time, because billions upon billions of religions people are waiting their teacher to come back, and they don't even realize that it's already happened. Just as with the Antichrist has already come and gone. It was an energy, actually, that was released through the access powers. So a lot of the things that people are interpreting and waiting for to come back, or to happen, because they consider this to be the end times, have already taken place and come and gone. So, it's time to look forward. It's time to start looking at other aspects of Revelation, which really are indicative of the unity and oneness of man, not the ending of the world. So where does this lead us now? Well, from 1977 to about 2010, so how long is that? I don't even know how many years that is. 33 years, I guess, is when it was. It took for Maitreya to be working behind the scenes to help create the environment for his public emergence, where he would eventually start to teach humanity directly, and gave an interview on TV. And this was an announcement that was made by Benjamin Crème in January of 2010. We don't know exactly when it happened. It could have happened in 2009. It could have even happened in 2008. And he just waited for a time to when it was okay for him to make the announcement. But for as far as I know, there's only one person that's recognized him on TV. Nobody else has recognized him, including myself. Because he's very adept at being able to be in plain sight and say what he needs to say, but yet be completely, quote unquote, hidden away at the same time. He's very adept at this. Very adept at using and speaking so simply the truths that he's wanting to impart on humanity to get us to ponder on. And yet we don't even realize that that's what's going on. So, anyway. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about to end kind of this background video on this is there's been a lot of talk about Israel and what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians. And it's shedding light on one of the centers of evil on this planet, the Zionist movement in Israel. Not the Israeli people, not the Jewish people around the world. I'm not saying they're evil. I'm not saying anything like that. Okay, and I'm not saying that to be politically correct. That's truly my belief. I don't think this is really anything to do with the Jewish faith or the Jewish people. But the evil that's perpetrated from these Zionists who want a greater Israel and the ethnic cleansing that they're doing in Gaza and the West Bank and so forth, is starting to be exposed, partly through social media, a lot of through the influencers of social media, and then a little bit through mainstream media. But it is wild what we're seeing in terms of this, not the ethnic cleansing, but the awareness of it and the concern that people are having of this. But one of the things that kind of the Zionist Christians are saying is that the Jewish people are the chosen people. And in a way they were, but they're not. Okay, so it's not that it does say in the Bible that the Jewish people are the chosen people. But the Jewish people in the Bible and what they were talking about is representative of all of humanity, not a group of people. And this has been the confusion that has caused so much pain and suffering for centuries, really. It's the same thing with Jerusalem. When John talked about the New Jerusalem, he was not talking about a city in Israel. He was talking about humanity. And Jerusalem really actually is just, all the meaning of it is a place of peace. So I say this all the time. People get so afraid and so paranoid about what they see based on what they're reading in Revelation, because innately we are fearful little beings. Right now we have so much fear in our lives, and so when we read into Revelations, we're reading in our fear, right? The destruction of all the world. That's what scares people so much. But if you look at it through joy and you look at it through unity and read Revelations in that way, it is actually the most hopeful book in the Bible. It is wild how differently we all read into what we're reading, and we're reading the same words, but we're reading it differently. But Jerusalem is a place of peace, not a city in Israel. The chosen people, meaning the Jews, is not the Jewish people. It is all of humanity. Even the 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament, which is representative of why there were 12 disciples around Jesus, they represented each of the tribes of Israel, has to do with the unity of humanity, harmony through diversity, not Israel itself. And the claims that Israel made for that land and moved all the Palestinians out to create these Israeli settlements is the reason why we still have an influence of evil on this planet in the way that we have, especially geopolitically. But the evil points that I'm trying to shed light on is the Zionist movement in Israel. This is one of the things that the Master said back in the 40s. The Zionist movement in Israel, the Pentagon, and in Eastern Europe. And if you look geopolitically over the last few decades especially, you will see just how destructive those 3 points have been. And now we're starting to see on both sides of the political aisle, not not from our politicians, because they're all bought off and paid for by AIPAC, but both political, both sides of the aisle in terms of the people are starting to see exactly what's going on in and around Israel and with Gaza, the influence that Israel has on our own lobby, or our own the lobby that they have with our own politicians, and how corrupt that is, and it's I think shaking things up. Where is this going to lead us? You know, what's going on in the United States affects pretty much everything in the world. You know, and what we're seeing is the total destruction of our systems is what we're seeing. And this is where Maitreya, if you listen, if you want to find Maitreya on TV, I don't advise looking for Maitreya, but if you listened to the priorities of Maitreya, the need for peace, the need to share, the need to bring about justice, you will start to probably hear what he's saying. I've never thought in a million years that Maitreya has retreated since he first gave his interview and stopped speaking to humanity, taken a step back or taken a break. I don't think he has at all. I think he's still speaking to humanity with the same frequency that he was before Benjamin Crème passed away. But here's the other thing I wanted to say too, is for those who are listening to this, whether you're coming upon this information for the first time or you've heard these videos before, the most important thing that we could all do is tell people in our lives just how important peace is. Even if you don't believe the principle of sharing will bring about justice and bring about peace, if you're not sure about that, it's fine. If we just tell people just how important peace is, our very future depends on this. You'll be helping to save humanity in a way that you can't possibly imagine. If you spread a little bit of hope that we're going to get through this and not destroy ourselves, you can also do the same thing too. So I challenge everyone who is listening to this to not buy into the fear and spread fear, and not buy into the violent rhetoric that people talk about, but to stand firm on the need for peace and the need to spread joy and hope. You have no idea how far out your thoughts go before they come back to you, and you have no idea how harmful or beneficial your thoughts are. I love you guys. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to putting up video in the very near future. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Remember to take action and help SOP save our planet. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again in future videos.